Welcome to another Ossett History Revision podcast with your head of history, Mr. Otway. In this podcast, we will explore reasons for the boom in the cattle industry, the changes in the cattle industry from cattle drives to huge ranches to more manageable sized ranches, and we'll also explore the life of a cowboy and how that changed as the industry changed. Why did the cattle industry boom, I hear you ask? Well, some cattle drives did take place before the American Civil War, but it was really after 1865, when the war had ended, that the cattle industry started to properly boom. Men who had previously herded cattle in the South had gone off to fight, leaving their herds to fend for themselves for 4 years. Poor cows. When they returned, they found that the herds had multiplied massively, and the cows had toughened up as a result of being left for so long to fend for themselves. So you have an estimated 5 million cattle roaming the grasslands of Texas. At the same time, when the war ends, you've got these cities in the north with plenty of wealthy people who would like to eat steak like a proper American, but there ain't no cows. Enterprising cattlemen saw that if they hired cowboys, gathered some of the huge herds of cows and drove them north to the railheads which were being constructed about 800 kilometres north, then they could transport the cattle to the northern towns and receive $40 per cow, 10 times the amount they could sell for in Texas. Regular trails, cattle trails, were established, such as the Chisholm Trail or the Western Trail, as more and more cattlemen hired cowboys to transport their cattle north to the railheads. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving decided to do something slightly different. Instead of transporting their cattle north to the railheads, they drove their cattle to a reservation where 7,000 Navajo Indians were being held captive and were close to starvation. They sold their cattle to the army and the Indians at the reservation and established what's got to be the greatest ever named trail in the world, the Goodnight Loving Trail. The cattle drives were profitable and popular. Lots of people got rich from it. But it was not ideal to have to transport the cattle so far to find people to sell the cattle to. Luckily for the cowboys and cattlemen, Joseph McCoy was to come up with the first major development in the cattle industry when he established Abilene. This was to be a place or a town on the railroad track at the end of the cattle drives, at which businessmen from the east in the cities could travel along the train tracks to Abilene and meet the cowboys who'd driven the cattle north, and buy the cattle before transporting them east, leaving the cowboys free to return south and collect more cows, and thus making the whole industry a bit more efficient. In 1867, 37,000 cows passed through Abilene, but by 1870, just 3 years later, that number had risen to 300,000 cows. Other cow towns sprang up through this as a result of having seen the success of Abilene. Some famous ones that you might have heard of, such as Dodge City, sounds cool, and Newton. And it has been estimated that nearly 4 million cows passed through the cow towns between 1867 to 85. Joseph McCoy and the other cattle dealers took a commission on every cow sold through their towns. Sadly, the cattle drives could not last forever, despite making many cattlemen very rich. There are 4 main reasons why the cattle drives ended. Firstly, homesteaders settling on the plains started to block the trails, and with the onset of the railways, or railroads as the Americans like to call them, there were more and more homesteaders coming to block the trails. Secondly, the US government made deals with the Plains Indians, and some of those deals included agreements in which cattlemen who drove their cattle across the Indian territories had to pay the Indians for the privilege of doing so. So that can become quite expensive. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, John Iliffe, who's the next significant figure in the cattle industry, showed how it would be easier and potentially more profitable to raise the cows on ranches in one place closer to the railheads, rather than carrying out the huge cattle drives. And so the move went from cattle drives to huge ranches began. Iliffe was successful for a number of reasons that others copied. Some examples of why he was so successful are because he could keep his cows in one place, or he did keep his cows in one place, and that meant he could control them and experiment with breeding to produce cows with sweeter meat. So you get a cow that might have some sweet meat and another cow with some sweet meat, and they make sweet, sweet cow love and produce sweet calves. Anyway, the sweeter meat is much more sought after. People will pay more for nicer meat. He also transported his beef to the cities in new refrigerated railroad cars, which meant you didn't have to pay to transport the whole animal. If you've got a slab of beef, or lots of slabs of beef, as you would get out of a cow, then we don't have to feed it. You don't have to water it. You don't have to keep it cool. Well, you do have to keep it cool. What am I talking about? But it's easier and cheaper to transport slabs of meat than it is to look after a cow for the whole journey. Iliffe himself was also successful in negotiating some contracts to supply meat, for example to the Union Pacific Railroad construction workers and to an Indian reservation. And others saw John Iliffe being so successful with his ranch, his huge ranch, and thought, we'll have a piece of that. The huge ranches soon took off, and many ranchers made huge amounts of money to equal the huge size of their ranches. But this period in the industry was, like the cattle drives, not to last forever. And unlike the cattle drives, the big ranches led to disaster for some cattlemen, who began to go bust. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, overstocking. Because cows were in high demand and sold for a lot of money, the ranchers tried to create the biggest herds possible so they could make more money. Sounds sensible. The problem, though, for many ranchers is that this put pressure on the grass available in their ranches, and in some cases the herds caused grass supplies to be exhausted, so there was not enough grass to support these colossal herds on the ranches. Secondly, there was a problem with demand. Eventually there were so many ranchers trying to sell millions of tons worth of beef that there was too much beef in the cities and the price fell. The reason why it had been $40 before is because beef was so rare to get there in the cities, certainly good quality beef. And now the opposite is the case. There's so much going into the cities that the price falls. The knock-on effect on this is that the cowboys, the cattlemen, the ranchers, had to sell more cows to make ends meet as the price had dropped. This meant they tried keeping even bigger herds, putting more pressure on the grass, and meaning that there was even more beef being produced and sent to the cities, so the price dropped further, and it was a terrible, terrible spiral. Thirdly, climate had an impact. As if things weren't bad enough, on top of the lower demand for beef and the problems of overstocking, there was a particularly cold winter in 1885. Some cows died, and the following summer was especially hot. Some more cows died, especially because the hot summer caused grass to wither and die. Then, the winter of 1886 was the worst in living memory. More cows died. All of this led to an estimated 15% of cows in the US dying, and the three problems of climate, overstocking, and lower demand meant that many ranchers went bankrupt by 1887. The boom in the cattle industry that began in 1865 had ended. But the cattle industry did continue. The cattle drives were no longer possible. The huge ranches had proven to be risky business, so there was only one more logical step for these cattlemen to go down. Smaller, more manageable ranches. Not tiny ranches, just smaller than the huge ones they had before. The new emphasis was on quality of meat rather than quantity, and they began to fence off their land using barbed wire, so that the new smaller herds were free to roam about and fewer cowboys were needed to look after them. This did also bring some conflict with the homesteaders and with other ranchers for the use of water supplies, something that you probably revise, hopefully, when you're looking at Law and Order. Until the wind pump was invented, that is, which helped both homesteaders and ranchers draw water from deep under the ground. The smaller ranches perhaps didn't leave ranchers dramatically richer, as the cattle drives and huge ranches had, but these types of ranch were more sustainable, less prone to extreme weather because smaller herds can be brought indoors. And also there was higher demand for top quality meat, which, due to the smaller herds, had not flooded the cities, and therefore demand remained high. So the smaller ranches, they were working. The final section we must look at in this podcast... Podcast? What's a podcast? Podcast is how the life of a cowboy changed from 1865 to 1900. Cowboys were usually young, single men, black, white, Indian or Mexican, sometimes ex-Confederate soldiers from the Civil War, and were usually hard-living, hard-drinking men who went wild in the saloons and brothels at the end of the long cattle drives. A great many cowboys were required for the cattle drives. Life was tough and dangerous on the cattle drives. They might be attacked by hostile Indians. For example, Oliver Loving, who helped establish my favourite trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, was killed by Indians. Not so good for him. Or, another danger, they might struggle to find a water supply significant enough for the thousands of cattle they herded at one time. In some places, white armed mobs attacked the cowboys and their herd to prevent ticks killing their domestic cows. The ticks were not deadly to the longhorn cattle driven by the cowboys, but were deadly to your average cow. There was always the risk of a stampede if something startled one of the cows. There was the danger of wolves, poisonous snakes, or scorpions. And rivers could be unpredictable, sweeping away cows and cowboys alike as they tried to cross them. Cowboys had ways of dealing with some threats, such as by containing the cows in a corral at night, which is basically a big boundary cordoned off by rope to stop the cows wandering away, and the cowboys would take it in turns to keep watch during the night. When the huge ranches became popular, the job of a cowboy changed, and fewer cowboys were needed. They no longer had to sleep outside on the open plain as they drove the cows north, but although the ranch itself could be several square miles, they were huge, these ranches. I may have mentioned this before, but I just want you to get this in your mind. Although they were huge, the cowboys could always ride back to the centre of the ranch to sleep indoors before setting out in the morning to find the herd again. One of the main duties of a cowboy on the huge ranches was to ride the line, which was to patrol the boundary of the land claimed by the ranch owner to prevent homesteaders or other ranchers from encroaching onto their land. They also shot predators and looked out for sick cows. With the onset of the smaller ranches and smaller herds, which happened later on, as we know, after we'd seen that the larger ranches had not been so successful. Well, these smaller ranches changed the life of a cowboy some more. The use of barbed wire, for example, meant there was no need for somebody to ride the line. Most cowboys had been, they weren't as needed. The few men that stayed on as cowboys lived far, far less dramatic lives than had happened previously. So the cattle industry changed dramatically during this period, and so did the life of a cowboy. I've been Mr. Otway, and you've just listened to an Ossett History Revision podcast on the American West. Remember to use your exercise books and revision guides to supplement the information you have heard here. Good luck with your revision.